The Bridge Initiative, I've written some questions I'll ask you later about, but our final speaker is Tamara Sonn. She is the Hamad bin Khalifa Al-Thani Professor in History and Islam at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She's written several books. Her most recent is Islam and Democracy After the Arab Spring with John Esposito, who seems to co-author a book with just about everybody in this room. And Islam, History, Religion, and Politics, as well as Is Islam the Enemy? A question, obviously, if you ask in Washington these days, especially of the administration, many would say, yes, Islam is the enemy, and they're not afraid to call out the enemy. That was like a big debate with President Obama. Why aren't you calling it, the Islamic radicals are the enemy instead of just calling it CVE or countering terrorists? But that somehow the Democrats were afraid to call out the enemy by their faith, Islam. So please welcome Tamara Sonn.
Thank you. And I'm going to keep my comments short. I know we're running behind schedule, so just a few comments. I'd like to build on what my colleagues have said. In particular, I'd like to focus on a theoretical aspect of something that Mubashir just discussed, the securitization of Muslims. I'd like to call attention in particular to patterns of securitization of migration in general. These are evident in Latin America, North Africa, and in Europe, especially since the beginning of the EU. So what is securitization? What do we mean by that? It's a theory, securitization theory. It developed in the late 1970s in the context of what is known as constructivism, an international relations theory, an IR theory called constructivism. That was a development in IR theory beyond the notion that states alone are the major actors in international relations. Instead, according to constructivism, international relations can be affected by more factors than just states. International relations can be affected by ideologies and transnational networks, for example. People associated with the Copenhagen School of IR came up with the notion of securitization in this context. Securitization, a useful definition, is a successful speech act through which an understanding is constructed within a political community to treat something as an existential threat. So securitization, again, a successful speech act through which an understanding is constructed within a political community to treat something as an existential threat. This definition is from Regions and Power, published by Cambridge University Press in 2003. It's by Barry Buzan and Ole Weaver, and I thank my student Anashua Dutta for that reference. So, non-state actors and non-military phenomena can be serious threats to a state if the body politic in that state develops the understanding that it is. If the body politic somehow comes to the agreement that X is an existential threat to the state, if the community at large somehow becomes convinced that X non-state phenomenon is a threat to their existence, then X has become securitized. That is what has happened to Islam and Muslims in today's world. They've become securitized, especially in the current US administration. Unlike the administration of President George W. Bush, as Mubashir just mentioned, who attempted to distinguish between Muslims and terrorists, representatives of the current administration assert that Islam itself is a threat. It is reasonable, this is a quote from a recently, well, a no longer as of recently, member of the current administration, it is reasonable to fear Islam and Muslims, or that Islam is not a religion, it's an ideology, or we have no choice but to stop Muslims from coming into this country. We have no choice until, I'm quoting, we figure out what the hell is going on. This is part of the process of securitization of Islam. The problem here is the same as that identified by President George W. Bush, the confusion between Islam and terrorism, obviously. Obviously, terrorism is a threat to all of us, but effectively combating it requires accurately understanding its sources, and that takes a modicum of historical knowledge and common sense. For example, if you read the complaints lodged by the classic terrorist, Osama bin Laden, he lists a litany of political complaints. They're political complaints. And then you compare those political complaints with two variables. One, opinion polls of Muslims' attitudes towards terrorism, which Dr. Esposito and Dalia have accurately documented. Muslims overwhelmingly condemn terrorism. But they also share political concerns with some terrorists and with many other people who aren't terrorists, regarding the support for authoritarian regimes, for example, against the expressed wishes of their populations, support for governments despite their violation of UN Security Council resolutions. These are concerns shared by many people, the majority of people not terrorists, and with terrorists. Second, compare the so-called Islamic terrorists' complaints with those of non-Islamic terrorists. They're the same complaints. That is, the ideology, whether it's secular or pseudo-religious, is an irrelevant variable. The constant are the political concerns. So, for example, until the formation of Hamas in the late 1980s, there were Palestinian groups resisting Israeli occupation, and some were using terrorist tactics. But they were using secular ideologies, not pseudo-religious ideologies. So the point is that focusing on Islam as the source of terrorism, whether in Europe or the US, that is, the securitization of Islam and Muslims, is missing the point. It makes it very difficult to address the real sources of terrorism. It's misguided. Banning Muslims will not resolve the problems that provide breeding grounds for terrorism. In fact, Muslims are themselves the majority of the victims of terrorists. That is why so many people are leaving their homes in war zones and seeking asylum, or at least the right to immigrate. Also, I want to mention a little bit about that strange iteration of securitization of Islam, the redefinition of Islam as not a religion, but an ideology. That's part of this, it's a tactic in the strategy of securitization of Islam. To redefine Islam as an ideology rather than a religion means that it's not illegal to discriminate against it. It is illegal to discriminate against a religion, but not illegal to discriminate against an ideology. So again, at the root of the focus on Islam and Muslims as a security threat is a misunderstanding of the root of terrorism, whose domestic political utility has been referred to. It's very useful politically because it can help construct X and X as a threat, and then be useful in gaining popularity for populist ideologues who can exploit the fears and loathings of those people least equipped to understand the complexities of global politics, to construct an understanding of Islam and Muslims as an existential threat because they don't know the broader history. They don't know what the sources of terrorism are. They don't know what are the policies that provide context for the development of terrorism of all sorts, and that provide threats to Muslims themselves. At the same time, misunderstanding the roots of terrorism through securitization of Islam and Muslims runs the risk of empowering the forces that actually exacerbate the situations that provide the context for radicalization, whatever its ideological trappings. Thank you.
Thank you.